With all of the wildfires, hurricanes, and earthquakes we've experienced this year, there's been a lot of talk of climate change. Now, we've seen such an increase in natural disasters. It's been extraordinary all around North America and the world. Dr. Roy Spencer is a meteorologist and principal research scientist at the University of Alabama. He is also a science team leader for the Advanced Microwave Scanning Radiometer on NASA's Aqua satellite. That's quite the title. Welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Hal.
You bet. Now, Dr. Spencer, why are we seeing such an increase in natural disasters? What's going on out there?
Well, we haven't seen an increase in severe weather from a meteorological standpoint. We do see an increase in damage, storm damage over time. For instance, in the United States, we see an increase in hurricane damage, and that's because we keep building more infrastructure along the coastlines. But, you know, some years are more stormy than others meteorologically. And for instance, this year, this hurricane season has been busy in the U.S., but it's been very quiet in the Pacific. And we frequently see that during hurricane season, is that the Pacific and the Atlantic sort of have a seesaw behavior, a flip-flop between, you know, one basin will be busy and the other one will be quiet, or vice versa. So this is basically just weather. It's not climate change.
So how do you explain Hurricane Harvey's record-setting rainfall totals and the devastation left behind by Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico?
Okay, the hurricane that hit Texas, Hurricane Harvey, the record rainfalls that occurred there wasn't because Harvey was that exceptionally strong, because we've had that strong of hurricane, you know, hit Texas before, and I've documented this in an ebook that I've written recently. So Harvey, the reason why Harvey's rainfalls were so intense is because Harvey did something very unusual. It stalled right after it reached the shoreline of Texas. And since the Gulf of Mexico is always warm enough to support hurricanes, any hurricane season, in fact, it's warm enough to support major hurricanes any hurricane season, that circulation just sat there and kept bringing moisture in off of the Gulf of Mexico for days. And that's what's caused the record rainfalls, was the fact that it didn't move. There's no part of global warming theory, though, that suggests that these systems will stop moving or slow down. That's just simply not the case.
Now, we regularly talk about headlines involving record-setting temperatures, and a lot of people who argue about climate change say that's what's caused a lot of the wildfires across California, Northern California, here in Alberta and Canada as well, and in British Columbia. How much are temperatures rising around the globe? Is there much of a problem with it right now?
Well, the temperatures are rising fairly slowly. The globally averaged rise is about 0.2 of a degree C per decade, which is pretty small. And it's rising at about half the rate of what the climate models say it should be rising. Now, clearly, that's not enough to explain a heat wave in California or in Alberta. But if you look at weather patterns, which is what has caused this, you'll find that, for instance, in the month of August, which is a month probably in both Alberta and California, where you have a lot of drying. If you don't have any rain, things are really getting dried out. The temperature changes this last August. You'll see that most of the United States was cool, was below normal. And usually when the central and eastern U.S. are below normal, the western states and western Canada are typically above normal, or at least southwestern Canada are above normal. This is just weather patterns, that when it gets warm out west, western North America, in the east it's cool. That's exactly what we saw. And this is just normal weather, weather variations. Now, the wildfires in California were made even worse because, number one, they had record rainfall. So they had a lot of new vegetation that grew during the wet season, during the winter. And then that dried out and it gave extra fuel to the fires. But then also, from what I've heard, the windstorm that they had blew down a bunch of power lines that hadn't been properly maintained and sparked fires, over a wide area, that sort of exploded all at once. And then that was fanned by the flames were fanned by the wind. So, this is just, this isn't climate change. This is weather.
Now, we're spending billions of tax dollars to reduce our carbon footprint. To what extent do carbon emissions cause global warming?
Well, we really aren't sure. If I had to make an educated guess based on researching this for the last 25 years, I would say about half of the modest warming we've seen globally is due to human carbon emissions. So that puts it as a, fairly insignificant. Well, it depends on what you think is significant. I mean, clearly, if we could stop emitting carbon, that would, be sort of an insurance policy against any future change. It just is, for the time being, we're stuck with fossil fuels. There are no large-scale replacements for fossil fuels just yet. Wind and solar won't do it. The demand for energy by humanity is too large, and wind and solar aren't dispatchable. The public still seems to have a bias against nuclear energy. So for the time being, there's not much we can do. And in fact, even the Paris Climate Agreement, if everybody abided by the Paris Climate Agreement that the U.S. has now, withdrawn from, it wouldn't make any measurable impact on future global temperatures. We know that. They've run the numbers. It's basically business as usual.
Do you think the biggest reason why the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement is because of the big money when it comes to energy in the industry?
Well, I think it's hard to say what President Trump is thinking when he does these things, but I suspect that he figured that it was unfair to the United States, which it is. I mean, even China and India, two of the biggest emitters in the world, were allowed to continue business as usual for a long time to come. You hear things like, oh, China is greatly increasing its solar capacity. Well, that may be true in a relative sense, but they're finishing a new coal-fired power plant about once every week or two in China as well. The demand for energy by humanity is simply too large to meet even the increase in demand with solar and wind. Yet we still need fossil fuels.
And I've seen a lot of the devastation. I see a lot of the pollution in Beijing and Singapore and China, people walking out every day with the masks. You're right, there's a new coal-fired plant that opens up, seems like every week in China. So unless maybe Asia gets their act together, I mean, those are the bigger polluters, I guess, in the world, right?
China's going through its industrial revolution, right? We did the same thing, and England did the same thing. Early on, you do a lot of polluting, but, the technology exists to clean up their act. And I think they're working on that because, it's causing a lot of deaths due to real air pollution. So they're starting to clamp down on their industry and their power generating plants, from what I've read, trying to clean things up. And that'll happen.
Well, I was reading recently a new study out that said 3 million people die in China annually as a result of the pollution there. I mean, we're talking 1 billion people, so if you look at the numbers, but still, that may be 3 million too many, right? In your recent book, An Inconvenient Deception, How Al Gore Distorts Climate Change, Science, and Energy Policy, you say both Gore and Bill Nye the Science Guy use fraudulent experiments to illustrate how carbon dioxide warms the atmosphere. Now, can you explain that?
Yeah, if you go to Al Gore's website, you'll find a video that they had that's been out there for at least a couple of years now. When he had that series of rock concerts around the world, I forget what it was called, when he was trying to drum up support for global warming, for us fighting global warming. They put out this video that Bill Nye, the Science Guy, helped out on. And it basically shows them measuring the temperature underneath a glass bowl inside a room, and then putting pure carbon dioxide into it, and then showing the temperature going up. And that's not the way the greenhouse effect works. There's no way for that to happen. And a TV meteorologist in California by the name of Anthony Watts, who knows a lot about video editing, went through that video and found that they had faked the video. And they would have had to fake it because it's impossible to increase the temperature, say, inside your house by making it pure CO2. That's not the way the greenhouse effect works.
Right, okay. Now, you've asserted energy policies promoted to fight global warming will actually harm the poor across North America and around the world. Why is that?
Well, sure. I mean, anything that you do that reduces prosperity is going to kill more people. If there's one thing that's increased, decreased mortality and increased longevity in the last 100 years, it's been access to abundant and affordable energy, because humans require energy for everything we do. Anything you can think of that humans do, it requires energy. And for the time being, most of that energy is going to come from fossil fuels. So if you don't want to go back to the Stone Ages and, life expectancy of 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, we've got to maintain that access to the abundant, affordable energy. The energy policies of our government, and I think Canada's government, though, is pushing in a direction for forcing more renewable energy on the masses, which is considerably more expensive. I mean, Germany is learning the lesson now because they've been experimenting with solar for a lot of years. And, their electricity now averages 3 times what it costs in the United States for electricity.
Now, carbon is viewed by many as a pollutant. How do you see carbon?
Well, first of all, let's make sure we give the right term. It's not carbon, it's carbon dioxide.
Right.
Carbon dioxide is necessary for life on Earth. Something that's necessary for life on Earth, I have a hard time calling it a pollutant, okay? It's necessary like oxygen is necessary for humans to live. Well, carbon dioxide is necessary for humans to live too, because the start of the food chain on land and in ocean requires photosynthesis. Whether it's plants on the land or whether it's phytoplankton in the ocean, the food chain in both land and ocean starts with CO2 as a necessary ingredient. And in fact, we are seeing over the years, since the 1980s, we have seen a greening of planet Earth from the increased CO2 fertilization effects, especially in semi-arid regions. It's been estimated that agricultural productivity has gone up by maybe trillions of dollars because of that increased carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. So yeah, increased CO2 might cause some warming. I think the amount of warming is fairly benign, but there are also benefits that are never mentioned. So no, I don't view it as a pollutant.
Now, some people claim your research is funded by fossil fuel corporations. Let me ask you, is it?
I wish it was, because it's hard for us to get money out of the U.S. federal government to do climate research that basically says that climate change isn't necessarily a big problem. Because if it isn't a big problem, you don't get money out of the U.S. Congress to study it. So we're sort of on the outs with other scientists. As far as my personal funding, I've never been asked by, for instance, Big Oil to do anything for them for pay. I mean, people figure that I must be a stooge for Big Oil. And in fact, some of the CEOs, let's say, of ExxonMobil, I think, has come out saying, yeah, well, they're for green energy now, and we got to get away from fossil. I really don't care what they say. They don't pay me to say anything. I have my own views. And if they all agree that, we need to start going more renewables, well, fine. I think eventually we are going to, but it can't be mandated by government. It has to come about naturally based on free enterprise and the free market and the costs and benefits as the public sees them.
Well, I know Volvo is looking at eliminating the combustible engine altogether. Europe's talking, Paris as well, eliminating, a lot of fossil fuel vehicles. It's all going to be electric cars in the next 3 or 4 years. So, yeah, the world is definitely changing.
They can talk all they want, but I doubt that that's going to happen. Can you imagine driving around Alberta in the dead of winter in an electric car? Your range is going to be about 30 miles, and then you're going to be stuck without any. I mean, the heat, just heating a car in the winter. This is something that's never discussed. Is if you want your electric car to also heat the air inside, you're using up about half of your energy just to keep from freezing to death.
So where do you see climate change, the controversy, and energy policy headed in the next few years?
I don't know. I really can't tell. I think the only way to stop this whole renewable energy juggernaut is for the public to learn, like the Germans have learned, that it's just not practical, that it's too expensive, and I think it's going to take a public revolt against it, because I've always felt, in my experience working with the United States government over the years, I've always had the impression that whatever the majority of the public wants, the politicians will side with. So right now it's sort of the politicians against the public. I think public is gradually swaying their support away from renewable energy because it's just not there yet. It's not ready. It's too expensive. And I think if there's enough people that say that, the politicians will follow suit.
Dr. Roy Spencer, meteorologist and principal research scientist from the University of Alabama, thanks so much for joining me on Bridge City News.
Thank you, Hal.